In the year 207 AD, deep in the windswept grasslands beyond China's northern frontier, two armies stood face to face on a mountain called White Wolf. One was led by Cao Cao, a warlord who had risen from questionable origins to control much of northern China through military force and political calculation. The other was commanded by Taodan, a nomadic chieftain attempting to unite the Wuhuan tribes into a cohesive military power. What happened next would take less than an afternoon, but the consequences would echo for centuries, effectively ending the Wuhuan as an independent political force and consolidating Cao Cao's control over northern China during the chaotic transition between the Han Dynasty and the Three Kingdoms period. This is the story of the Battle of White Wolf Mountain, a pivotal clash that reshaped East Asian geopolitics. To understand why this battle mattered, we need to examine the world that produced it, a world in the midst of systemic collapse. The Eastern Han Dynasty, which had ruled China for nearly 2 centuries, was failing. The breakdown wasn't sudden, but gradual, driven by interconnected problems: land concentration in the hands of wealthy families, peasant immiseration, court corruption, and the erosion of central authority. The crisis point came in 184 AD with the Yellow Turban Rebellion, a massive peasant uprising that combined religious millenarianism with economic grievances. Though imperial forces eventually suppressed the rebellion, the Han government never recovered its monopoly on military power. Regional commanders who had raised armies to fight the rebels refused to disband them. Power devolved to warlords who commanded their own forces, collected their own revenues, and increasingly ignored imperial authority. By the 190s, China had fragmented into competing military regimes. Among these warlords, Yuan Shao appeared to hold the strongest position. He controlled 4 provinces in the north and came from a family that had produced high officials for 4 generations, significant social capital in a Confucian society that valued lineage. His military resources were substantial, and many observers considered him the likely victor in the struggle to reunify China. Yuan Shao's main rival was Cao Cao, whose background was far less impressive. Cao Cao's father had been a eunuch, and his father was an adopted son, origins that carried considerable stigma in Han society. What Cao Cao lacked in pedigree, however, he compensated for with military ability and political skill. He proved adept at recruiting talent, managing logistics, and exploiting his opponent's weaknesses. The confrontation between Yuan Shao and Cao Cao came in 200 AD at Guandu. Despite commanding significantly larger forces, estimates suggest Yuan Shao had roughly 4 to 5 times as many troops, Yuan Shao suffered a decisive defeat. Cao Cao's forces destroyed Yuan Shao's supply depot in a night raid, causing Yuan Shao's army to disintegrate. Modern analysis attributes Cao Cao's victory to better intelligence gathering, more flexible command structures, and Yuan Shao's own tactical errors. Yuan Shao died in 202 AD, possibly from illness exacerbated by the stress of defeat. His death created a succession crisis that would prove fatal to his family's power. Yuan Shao had designated his youngest son, Yuan Sheng, as his heir, a decision that violated the principle of primogeniture. His eldest son, Yuan Tan, contested this choice, believing birth order gave him the superior claim. The middle son, Yuan Si, found himself caught between his brothers' competing ambitions. Civil war within the Yuan family quickly followed. Cao Cao exploited these divisions effectively. He formed a temporary alliance with Yuan Tan against Yuan Shang, then turned on Yuan Tan once he'd weakened the other brothers. By 205 AD, Yuan Tan was dead. Yuan Shang and Yuan Si, their armies defeated and their territories occupied, fled north, beyond the Chinese frontier to seek protection from the Wuhuan. The Wuhuan were a nomadic pastoral people inhabiting the grasslands of what is now Inner Mongolia and Liaoning province. They raised horses and cattle, practiced mobile warfare centered on cavalry tactics, and maintained a complex relationship with Chinese states, sometimes raiding, sometimes serving as mercenaries, sometimes trading. Chinese sources often grouped them with other northern peoples, like the Xiongnu and Xianbei, but the Wuhuan maintained distinct tribal structures and cultural practices. During his rise to power, Yuan Shao had cultivated relationships with Wuhuan leaders through gift-giving, symbolic titles, and arranged marriages. These connections meant the Wuhuan were willing to shelter his sons. More importantly, the presence of the Yuan brothers and Chinese followers offered the Wuhuan military leader Cao Cao an opportunity. Cao Cao controlled multiple Wuhuan tribes and commanded a substantial cavalry force. Historical sources suggest he aspired to build a unified nomadic confederation. The addition of Chinese troops and the symbolic legitimacy provided by the Yuan name potentially gave him the resources to threaten Chinese territories or resist Chinese military pressure. For Cao Cao, this situation posed a strategic problem. The Yuan brothers represented potential rallying points for opposition to his rule. As long as they lived, they could attract defectors and complicate his political consolidation. The Wuhuan under Cao Cao represented a military threat on his northern frontier. Standard strategic logic suggested these problems needed to be addressed, but addressing them would require an extremely risky military operation. In 207 AD, Cao Cao decided to launch a military expedition deep into Wuhuan territory to eliminate both the Yuan brothers and Cao Cao's emerging power base. Many of his subordinates considered this decision questionable. The operational challenges were significant. First, the Wuhuan territory lay hundreds of miles beyond the Chinese frontier across difficult terrain. Supply lines would be extended and vulnerable. Second, the campaign season was already advanced. Operating in the northern grasslands as winter approached created obvious logistical risks. Third, Cao Cao's strategic position elsewhere wasn't fully secure. Other warlords, particularly Liu Biao in the Middle Yangtze region and Sun Quan consolidating power in the south, could potentially threaten his territories while his army was engaged in the north. Several generals argued against the expedition. The risks seemed to outweigh the potential gains. Why not wait for Cao Cao to make the first move and respond defensively? But Guojia, one of Cao Cao's key strategic advisors, argued for immediate offensive action. His reasoning focused on several factors. First, the Wuhuan wouldn't expect an attack at this time of year, providing tactical surprise. Second, Cao Cao's political control over the various Wuhuan tribes was probably not fully consolidated, making them vulnerable if struck quickly. Waiting allowed Cao Cao time to strengthen his position and potentially launch his own attacks. And eliminating the Yuan brothers would remove a persistent source of political instability. Guojia also calculated that other warlords were unlikely to attack Cao Cao's rear during this campaign. Doing so while he was fighting beyond the frontier could be portrayed as treacherous and damage their political legitimacy. Cao Cao accepted this analysis and approved the expedition. The army he assembled numbered somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 troops, sources vary. The force included experienced units and capable commanders: Zhang Liao, who had proven effective in cavalry operations, Chu Chun, who led elite mounted units, and Shu Han and Shu Chu, who were both competent field officers. Logistics and intelligence were critical concerns. Cao Cao needed guides familiar with the territory, interpreters, and information about Wuhuan positions. He recruited Tian Chu, a local official with knowledge of frontier regions, and Yan Rao, who had previously worked with Yuan Shao and knew the area. The operational plan relied on deception. Rather than advancing along obvious routes that the Wuhuan would monitor and could easily block, Cao Cao planned to feint north, then appeared to abandon the campaign due to difficulties. This would make the Wuhuan lower their guard. Then, guided by Tian Chu, the army would use an abandoned Han Dynasty frontier road through territory the Wuhuan no longer watched. If successful, this would position Cao Cao's forces deep in Wuhuan territory where they weren't expected. It was a high-risk approach. The abandoned road might be impassable. The army would be operating far from its supply base in potentially hostile territory. If the Wuhuan detected the movement in time, Cao Cao's army could face disaster. In summer 207, the army began its march. The operational approach had succeeded. The movement north proved difficult. The route followed dried riverbeds and crossed grasslands that offered little shelter from heat. Water sources were scattered and sometimes contaminated. Men and horses suffered from the conditions. Following the deception plan, Cao Cao had signs erected along main roads announcing the campaign's suspension due to terrain difficulties and the advanced season. The signs claimed operations would resume later under better conditions. Wuhuan scouts reported this information to Taodan, who apparently accepted it as genuine. The Wuhuan reduced their surveillance and returned to their camps, believing the immediate threat had passed. Meanwhile, Cao Cao's army left the main routes and followed Tianchu's alternative path, the abandoned Han Dynasty frontier road. Conditions were as challenging as anticipated. Sections of the road had eroded. The army had to repair bridges, clear overgrown areas, and navigate terrain that hadn't seen military use in decades. Progress was slow. Then, weather complicated matters further. Heavy rains turned the route to mud. Men struggled through difficult conditions, extracting stuck wagons and horses. The rains also brought disease. Soldiers fell ill, probably from exhausted bodies and contaminated water. Among those who became sick was Guojia himself. Guojia's illness was serious enough that Cao Cao sent him back toward the rear with an escort to recover. This was problematic for army morale. Guojia had been the primary advocate for the campaign, and his absence raised questions about its wisdom. Some officers argued for retreat. They were deep in hostile territory, supplies were strained, their key strategist was gone, and conditions were deteriorating. Withdrawing now would cut losses and allow another attempt under better circumstances. Cao Cao refused to retreat. Several factors likely influenced this decision. The resources already invested in the expedition, the propaganda value Taodan would gain from forcing Cao Cao to withdraw, and the basic calculation that they'd already passed the point where retreat was clearly safer than continuing forward. Additionally, scouts were reporting that the deception had worked. The Wuhuan weren't prepared for an immediate attack. The army pushed forward. After weeks of difficult marching, they emerged from the frontier route near Luxing, close to where Taodan had concentrated his forces. The operational approach had succeeded. Cao Cao's army had achieved tactical surprise. But now, they would have to fight. When Taodan received reports that Cao Cao's army had appeared near Liuxing, his initial reaction was reportedly disbelief. The Chinese army wasn't supposed to be there. They'd supposedly abandoned the campaign weeks ago. The reports must be wrong, or perhaps this was a small raiding force that had gotten lost. This confusion was understandable, but costly. The Wuhuan hadn't prepared defensive positions or concentrated their full strength. Their warriors were dispersed across various camps. This gave Cao Cao a critical window of opportunity. The sources indicate that when Taodan finally accepted that Cao Cao's main army had indeed arrived, he rapidly assembled the forces immediately available, probably something between 10,000 and 30,000 cavalry, though exact numbers are disputed. He also brought the Yuan brothers, Yuan Shang and Yuan Shi, whose presence would symbolically rally both Wuhuan and Chinese troops to his cause. The location was White Wolf Mountain, a commanding height in the grassland landscape. Taodan apparently chose this position to negate some of Cao Cao's tactical advantages. The Wuhuan would have high ground and could use their superior cavalry mobility to attack downhill. Cao Cao faced a tactical problem. His infantry-heavy force was exhausted from the long march and operating deep in enemy territory. The Wuhuan cavalry held the high ground and outnumbered his mounted forces. A conventional assault uphill against cavalry would likely result in heavy casualties, possibly defeat. However, Cao Cao had one significant advantage: Cao Chen's elite cavalry units, often called the Tiger and Leopard cavalry in later sources. These were heavily armed and armored mounted troops, more heavily equipped than typical Wuhuan horsemen. They were also well-trained and experienced, essentially professional soldiers rather than tribal warriors. Cao Cao made a calculated decision.
rather than wait for his full army to deploy, which would give the Wuhuan time to fully organize and possibly call in reinforcements. He would launch an immediate cavalry assault with his elite units. This violated conventional military wisdom about attacking prepared positions with insufficient forces, but Cao Cao apparently judged that surprise and momentum could compensate for numerical disadvantage. Zhang Lao led the attack. The sources describe a rapid uphill cavalry charge that hit the Wuhuan position before they were fully prepared. The heavily armored Chinese cavalry punched through the Wuhuan lines, causing disruption and confusion. What happened next suggests the Wuhuan force wasn't as cohesive as Tadun had hoped. Rather than maintaining formation and using their numerical superiority to surround and overwhelm the attacking cavalry, portions of the Wuhuan force broke. This could indicate several things. The different tribal components may not have had unified command, the surprise of the attack may have been psychologically disruptive, or the Wuhuan warriors may have calculated that they were individually vulnerable to heavily armored opponents and chose to withdraw rather than press the engagement. Once sections of the Wuhuan line began retreating, the situation deteriorated rapidly. In cavalry combat, a force that loses cohesion becomes extremely vulnerable. Individual warriors fleeing in different directions can be run down piecemeal. The collapse appears to have been cascading. As some units withdrew, others followed, until what had been an organized defensive position turned into a rout. Tadun died in the fighting. Sources don't specify exactly how, whether he was killed leading a counterattack, attempting to rally his troops, or trying to escape. His death removed whatever unified command structure the Wuhuan had, making the collapse irreversible. The Yuan brothers, seeing the battle was lost, fled the field with whatever forces remained loyal to them. They managed to escape immediate capture, but lost most of their followers in the process. Chinese sources claim that Cao Cao's cavalry killed or captured thousands of Wuhuan warriors, along with significant numbers of their nobles and chieftains. They also report capturing large amounts of livestock, armor, and other goods. These numbers should be treated cautiously. Victorious commanders routinely inflated casualty counts and loot hauls. But the basic fact seems clear. The Wuhuan suffered a catastrophic defeat that shattered their military power. The battle itself probably lasted only a few hours. The tactical dynamics, a cavalry engagement where one side lost cohesion, typically resolved quickly one way or the other. By late afternoon, it was over. Cao Cao had achieved his operational objectives. Tadun was dead. The Wuhuan confederation was broken. The Yuan brothers were fugitives with no significant military force. The campaign, which had seemed on the verge of failure during the difficult march, had succeeded decisively at the critical moment. But this raises an important question. Why did Cao Cao win? Was it military genius, as later Chinese historians often claimed, or were there more mundane explanations? Several factors seem relevant. First, the operational deception worked. The Wuhuan were caught unprepared, which provided tactical surprise. Second, Cao Cao had better quality cavalry, more heavily armed and armored than the Wuhuan horsemen. Third, the Wuhuan confederation under Tadun may not have been as unified as it appeared. The rapid collapse suggests weak cohesion between different tribal components. Fourth, Cao Cao was willing to accept tactical risks that other commanders might have avoided, launching an immediate attack rather than waiting to deploy his full army. Luck also played a role. If the weather during the march had been worse, the army might never have reached Liuxing. If Tadun had detected the approach earlier, he could have avoided battle entirely or prepared more thoroughly. If the initial cavalry charge had been repulsed, Cao Cao's force might have been destroyed far from its supply base. Military outcomes often depend on such contingencies. The narrative of inevitable victory written by later historians obscures the real uncertainties commanders face. The immediate aftermath of the battle was less dramatic than the battle itself, but equally important to understanding its consequences. Following the victory at White Wolf Mountain, Cao Cao didn't immediately pursue the Yuan brothers. Instead, he focused on consolidating control over the region. Wuhuan leaders who survived the battle were offered terms: submit to Cao Cao's authority, provide hostages as guarantees of loyalty, and potentially serve in his military forces. Many accepted these terms, having little alternative. Some Wuhuan tribes were relocated to areas within Chinese territory where they could be more easily supervised. This wasn't an unusual policy. Chinese dynasties had long practice in managing defeated nomadic groups, incorporating some into military service, resettling others, playing different tribal factions against each other. Cao Cao was following established patterns, albeit adapted to his specific circumstances. The fate of the Yuan brothers took several more months to resolve. Yuan He was captured relatively quickly and executed. Yuan Shang managed to evade immediate capture and fled further north, seeking refuge with the Gongsun clan that controlled Liudan Commandery. But Gongsun Kong made his own calculation. With the Wuhuan defeated and Cao Cao in a strong position, harboring Yuan Shang was becoming a liability rather than an asset. In 207 or 208, Gongsun Kong had Yuan Shang and his brother Yuan He, who apparently had not been captured earlier as some sources suggest, executed, then sent their heads to Cao Cao. This effectively ended the Yuan family's challenge to Cao Cao's power. What had been the most powerful clan in northern China was eliminated as a political force within 8 years of Yuan Shao's death at Guandu. The campaign had costs that aren't always emphasized in triumphalist accounts. Guo Jia, the strategist whose advice had been crucial to undertaking the expedition, never recovered from the illness he contracted during the march. He died in 207, shortly after the army returned to Chinese territory. He was only 38 years old. Cao Cao reportedly grieved deeply at his death, not just for personal reasons, but because he'd lost one of his most capable advisors. Later events, particularly Cao Cao's defeat at
Red Cliffs in 208-209, might have gone differently had Guo Jia been alive to offer counsel. The campaign also stretched Cao Cao's resources. Moving an army that distance, sustaining it in hostile territory, and dealing with the logistical difficulties required significant expenditure of money, grain, and materiel. While the loot captured from the Wuhuan offset some costs, the overall financial burden was considerable. Additionally, while Cao Cao's other rivals hadn't attacked his rear during the campaign, they'd used the time to strengthen their own positions. Liu Biao continued consolidating control in the middle Yangtze. Sun Quan was building up naval forces in the south. The breathing space Cao Cao's absence provided would prove significant in later conflicts. Nevertheless, from Cao Cao's perspective, the campaign achieved its core objectives. The northern frontier was secured. A major potential threat was eliminated. His control over northern China was no longer contested by credible rivals. This freed him to turn attention southward, which he did in 208 with his campaign against Liu Biao and the subsequent confrontation at Red Cliffs. The White Wolf Mountain campaign demonstrated that decisive military action, despite significant risks, could reshape strategic situations. It also demonstrated the limits of what military force could achieve. Eliminating the Yuan family threat and the Wuhuan confederation didn't actually lead to reunification of China under Cao Cao's rule. The Three Kingdoms period was just beginning. The Battle of White Wolf Mountain had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate elimination of the Yuan family and the defeat of Tadin's confederation. Understanding these longer-term effects requires examining several interconnected developments. First, the battle essentially ended the Wuhuan as an independent political force. Prior to 207, the Wuhuan had been significant players in northern frontier politics for centuries. They'd served as mercenaries, raided Chinese territories, formed alliances with Chinese factions, and maintained their own political structures. After White Wolf Mountain, they effectively disappear from Chinese historical records as independent actors. The tribes were broken up, resettled, incorporated into Chinese military units, or absorbed by other nomadic groups like the Shenbai. Within a generation, the Wuhuan had ceased to exist as a distinct people with political agency.
This wasn't genocide in the modern sense. There was no systematic attempt to kill all Wuhuan people. Rather, it was the destruction of their political and military structures, followed by assimilation and dispersal. Many Wuhuan individuals probably continued to identify with their heritage privately, but they no longer had tribal organizations or military forces capable of independent action. From the perspective of state formation and ethnic consolidation, this represents a significant moment in how northern China's multi-ethnic frontier regions were incorporated into centralized Chinese political structures. Second, the campaign established a template for how later Chinese dynasties would deal with nomadic powers. The combination of military force, political deception, strategic surprise, and post-conquest incorporation became a standard approach. Later campaigns against the Xianbai, the Rojin, the Turks, and eventually the Mongols before they conquered China all show similar patterns. The White Wolf Mountain campaign wasn't the first time these tactics were used, but its success reinforced their value in Chinese strategic thinking. Third, the battle had implications for the ongoing collapse of the Han Dynasty and the emergence of the Three Kingdoms. By securing his northern frontier, Cao Cao eliminated one potential direction of threat. This allowed him to focus military resources southward. In 208, he launched a major campaign against Liu Biao's territory in the Middle Yangtze region. Liu Biao conveniently died, his sons fought over succession, and Cao Cao's armies rapidly occupied the territory. This southward expansion led directly to the Battle of Red Cliffs in 208-209, where Cao Cao's forces faced a coalition of Liu Bei and Sun Quan. Red Cliffs resulted in Cao Cao's most significant military defeat and effectively established the three-way division of China that would persist for decades. Had the White Wolf Mountain campaign failed, Cao Cao might never have been in a position to attempt southward expansion, and the entire trajectory of the Three Kingdoms period might have been different. Fourth, the campaign had cultural and historical reverberations through Chinese literature and popular culture. The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the 14th century novel that dramatized this period, included the White Wolf Mountain campaign in its narrative. While the novel freely embellished historical events for dramatic purposes, its portrayal of Cao Cao as a brilliant but ruthless strategist willing to take enormous risks drew partly on campaigns like this one. The novel's influence extended to opera, drama, and eventually modern media, including films, television series, and video games. So while White Wolf Mountain isn't as famous as battles like Red Cliffs or Guandu, it contributed to the broader cultural memory of the Three Kingdoms era. Fifth, the campaign offers insights into how pre-modern states managed expansion and consolidation. Cao Cao's regime was built through a combination of military conquest, bureaucratic administration, land reform, refugee resettlement, canal building, and talent recruitment. The White Wolf Mountain campaign was one piece of this larger state-building project. By eliminating external threats and bringing frontier regions under control, Cao Cao could focus on internal administration. His son, Cao Pi, would eventually force the last Han emperor to abdicate in 220, establishing the Wei Dynasty. While Wei didn't reunify China, that would take another 60 years, and the Jin Dynasty, it represented a functioning state apparatus that controlled significant territory and population. The mechanisms Cao Cao developed for taxation, military recruitment, agricultural production, and administrative control influenced later Chinese dynasties. In this sense, White Wolf Mountain contributed indirectly to institutional developments that shaped Chinese governance for centuries. Sixth, there are broader questions about the relationship between military force and political legitimacy. Cao Cao came from dubious social origins and rose to power through military violence during a period of state collapse. He never became emperor himself, but his descendants did. The question of whether such power could be legitimized troubled Chinese political philosophers for centuries.
Confucian ideology emphasized moral virtue and proper succession. Yet practical reality was that new dynasties were typically founded by military strongmen. The Three Kingdoms period exemplified this tension. All three kingdoms were founded by men who'd seized power through force, yet all three claimed to represent legitimate continuation of Chinese civilization. Later historians, writing under established dynasties, had to navigate this contradiction. They praised Cao Cao's military abilities while criticizing his ruthlessness. They acknowledged his state-building achievements while questioning his moral character. This ambivalence reflected deeper anxieties about the foundations of political order. The White Wolf Mountain Campaign, as an example of successful military ruthlessness, became part of these debates. And finally, there's a counterfactual question worth considering. What if the campaign had failed? If Cao Cao's army had been trapped and destroyed in Wuhuan territory, the entire trajectory of 3rd century China would have changed. Tadin might have built a powerful nomadic confederation. The Yuan brothers might have used Wuhuan backing to rebuild their power. Other Chinese warlords would have been emboldened to challenge Cao Cao's weakened regime. The Three Kingdoms period might not have been, or might have involved different actors and different boundaries. This reminds us that historical outcomes aren't inevitable. They result from decisions, circumstances, and often luck. Cao Cao's victory at White Wolf Mountain shaped subsequent history, but it was contingent on factors that could easily have gone differently. A worse storm during the march, a Wuhan scout detecting the army earlier, a different tactical decision by Tadin, any of these could have produced a different outcome. The Battle of White Wolf Mountain lasted less than a day, but its consequences rippled across centuries. It eliminated the Wuhuan as an independent political force, ended the Yuan family's challenge to Cao Cao's power, secured northern China's frontier, and set the stage for the Three Kingdoms period that would define Chinese politics for the next 60 years. Yet the battle's significance extends beyond immediate political outcomes. It illustrates how pre-modern states managed frontier regions and nomadic peoples. It demonstrates the role of risk-taking, deception, and tactical surprise in military operations. It shows how individual commanders' decisions, operating under uncertainty with imperfect information, can reshape broader historical trajectories. The battle also reminds us that history isn't a simple story of progress or decline.